Hello and welcome to BCM300. Today I am joined by game designer Richard Hall. Say hello, Richard.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing absolutely great. It is a wonderful day and we get to talk about games.
We are talking about games and we are going to be talking about themes and settings of games. I've put together a kind of mix of different themes and different settings that we can kind of talk about as we go through. This is an experiment for us. We are testing this format, and so you've got the Prezi there with you.
Yes, I do.
I'm going to flick onto the first slide, and the first theme that we have to talk about is a very common theme. We talked about this last week in terms of the niche and hobby industries, and this is of course the war game, the theme of conquest.
By last week we of course mean in the previous lecture, because scheduling's been weird.
Thank you. Yes. In the previous episode,
we're going to get a bat signal.
Typically war and conquest as a theme, at least over the last, let's say, 100 years, has been about military recreation and simulation between real-world analogs. So here, my slide, yep. So I'm looking at Axis and Allies. That was one of my first experiences with board games outside of the traditional Milton Bradley Hasbro mass market game. Axis and Allies is a military simulation recreating the late World War II period, which includes America's intervention in the Pacific. Have you played this one?
Yeah, I have. Only briefly, and I wasn't very good at it. The category of military themed board game is immensely immensely pervasive. It is at the point where it is actually kind of difficult to pick out specific examples, because there are simply so many that there are subgenres of war game that are bigger than entire genres in other formats.
Obviously, Warhammer being one of those. This is an Ameritrash game.
I talked over you there.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say, this is a Ameritrash game. Lots of lots of plastic miniatures, high production, lots of dice rolling, lots of opposed tables.
Interestingly, you're going to see a trend towards Ameritrash when it comes to war games, not just because of the high materiality, but because the center of the Euro game type, the counterpoint of low chance and whatnot type games, was Germany, which, funnily enough, Germany not exactly brimming with nostalgia for World War II, which is where a lot of these games get their footings.
I'm going to move us on to talk about Risk, which is actually a precursor to Axis and Allies. It's a game of global domination that has a nice card mechanic. We'll talk about mechanics more next week, but
effectively a set collection game with a really, really slow draw process. Yeah,
and opposed dice rolls, and the theme here is quite interesting because it is global domination, and the original theme is Napoleonic Wars. So even though it's global domination, it's using kind of Napoleonic horse cav cannons and soldiers.
And this is a great chance to dig into what you can consider the basic assumptions of a game. In the context of Risk, the basic assumption is that taking Siberia is meaningful as an addition to the value of your war machine, which that's not exactly very true these days. Not that Siberia is a terrible place or anything like that. It's not a place that's brimming with weapons manufacturers right now.
When I played this as a probably a 10, 11, 12-year-old, I would always try and get Australia, and I would, in my mind, imagine, kind of ockerish Australians in thongs and stubbies and VB kind of colonizing the world. I'm moving on to diplomacy. This is an interesting game that doesn't have dice rolls, but it is still a European domination game where you're trying to take over the world or take over Europe, but you can enter into negotiations with your allies. I'll move on from diplomacy.
We've talked enough about diplomacy
previously. Shogun, have you played?
Hasn't diplomacy done enough?
Have you played Shogun?
Yeah, I have played Shogun. Shogun is an excellent little example of one of those games that started out as a very Euro form, and if you find the older editions or in the older art, you've got a nice new edition of Shogun, which is great because Shogun used to look like a wall calendar.
Yes.
And so far, we've discussed at this point 4 different war games, and none of them have had the same mechanics for representing the war. In the case of Risk, you have dice rolling. In diplomacy, in Axis and Allies, you have positional tactical movement along with dice rolling. In diplomacy, it's all hidden actions that are all processed at the same time. And in this one, to represent combat, you literally take all the figures, all the cubes that are meant to represent the soldiers, and you chuck them in a tower. And whichever side comes out winning is the winner. And these are letting you represent very different visions of war and militarism through your through your theme.
Yeah, we'll come back next week and talk more about specific mechanics. And I guess I kind of want to point out that war as a theme and global conquest or conquest within nations as a setting, it doesn't have to be done in one particular way. Shogun does it a different way. I'm going to move on to Twilight Imperiun, which is the So this is an interesting theme and setting. I think you could say that the setting is, of course, galactic expansionism, but the theme is still conquest. It is still being the dominant hegemonic power, just no longer in Europe or Japan or the world, but intergalactic relations.
Yeah, the nature of all the systems of Twilight Imperium is that they are layered around the point where you get to fighting with guns. So for all that you can play Twilight Imperium without combat being the central focus for your group or your species, it's still gonna be there. It's still very much lurking in the background. And indeed, that's one of the things with a lot of these war games, these assumption that war is an inevitability and that war is always going to be the thing that winds up answering these questions. So conversations tend to be about avoiding or circumventing war, much like having a great big dog in the house that you don't want to talk about.
We'll come back again. We're going to do a lot of signposting today, but we'll come back later on in these lectures and talk about engagement and enrollment and conflict between players, as well as cooperation. War, you can have cooperation with diplomacy, with Axis and Allies, with Twilight Imperium. These allow for cooperation between players, but you're still picking on someone else. You're still trying to directly defeat another person, and that's kind of the setting.
That's not to say that there aren't cooperative war games. There absolutely are. There's like D-Day Dice, and that you're representing it's a cooperative game about getting up the beach on D-Day.
Well said. Yeah. So you're exactly right. War doesn't have to be about direct engagement between players. It can be cooperative.
It's just that's the easiest thing in the world to design by comparison.
My favorite version of the war game is Scythe. You know of my love for Scythe. I like this in terms of its setting because it takes traditional war and then adds in the speculative notion of alternative history. What if history went differently? And instead of nuclear power, we have diesel power and Tesla's electric power, and a totally different European landscape to build an empire and engage in conquest.
Worth noting in the case of the theme of Scythe is, again, it's a war game, but it is a war game where very rarely are you actually directly attacking people, because its vision of war is one about distribution of resources. If someone has a distinct resource advantage with you, experienced Scythe players will not pick a fight, because now is not the time to try and win a fight where someone has more resources.
It does depend on your build, which is what I quite like about this game. Every game is different, and you build up your resources differently, and there's a little bit of randomization in that. But if you get a nice little military bonus, you can definitely go down a conquest strategy. But I've had 5 games in a row where no one had a fight with anyone.
It is still in the framing context of war. Militarized objects are moving around, and generals are making decisions that avoid those conflicts because they are expenditure of resources, not because, well, no, we don't shoot at those people.
I want to move on to the historical theme. Because this is, I mean, none of these themes are brackets. None of these are exclusionary terms. They're just convenient ways of grouping different themes together in order to talk about them. I mean, obviously, most of those war games were historical games.
Sorry, I talked over you there. Remember, when it comes to genre, we use the term genre like it's a box, but what it really is more like a tag. Axis and Allies is a historical game, and it's a war game, and it's a dice chucker, and it's a minis on a board kind of game. There's a lot of different handles to use.
First up in my historical genre games is Seven Wonders. We won't talk too much about the mechanics here, which are lovely. I really enjoyed this game.
I'm sitting here going, I don't get to talk about the mechanics of Seven Wonders.
We'll come back. We'll come back next week. But thematically, this is a kind of classical and antiquity, where you are building up your empire through, again, various different thematic elements, whether it's military, resource, knowledge, and is lovely as part of this one as well.
You might recognize this kind of structure as a very Eurocentric vision of the advancement of civilizations. The idea that there's like a kind of a ladder, and civilizations just kind of climbing up it.
This is a very common motif.
Yeah. Not to rubbish on this specifically. I'm not like, Seven Wonders, it's doing that thing again. But it's just like, once you start to realize that this is a thing that culture and media does, you can't stop noticing it. It is everywhere.
Absolutely. I put in Age of Napoleon because it's on my wish list. I've always wanted to play this game because of its reputation as having a high degree of fidelity and detail when it comes to the period of the Napoleonic conquests.
Yeah, we have a bit of a wonderful luxury when it comes to these periods of history, because for a start, a lot of this stuff was remarkably well documented in the kinds of ways that we want for game design, and it was already a period where the war itself was heavily systemized. People would actually have wars by lining up my soldiers on one side, your soldiers on another, and then we try to move them around each other tactically. And then one side can tap out. And that's super weird, but it means that for a period they're documenting and systematizing these historical periods into games was extraordinarily easy.
One of the interesting things about the historical setting, and we'll talk about audiences more in the discussions over the next few weeks, but you could go to any historical period on, say, Wikipedia, and you could make a game for 10 to 12-year-olds on a historical setting, say Napoleonic era, and you could get everything you need for that from Wikipedia. You don't need to be a historical expert in order to make a historical setting game, unless you're ratcheting that audience up. Now, this is definitely, I would say, 15 plus in terms of just comprehension of the amount of reading that you have to do, and actually requiring a high level of literacy and education to be able to read that. So therefore your audience is very different, and that's where you really do want to have an expertise in that period.
Information retention is a thing. You're going to find that players actually have a limit for how much info they can handle at a time. And when you start dealing with younger players, that limit gets smaller and smaller in really irregular ways.
I'm just moving on to Agricola. This is my wife's favorite game. It's very much a kind. Oh gosh, now I've just lost. It's very much a medieval village style game building. I'll move on quickly because I don't want to spend too much on these. Colosseum.
Agricola is an Uwe Rosenberg deal. That's a name worth looking up.
Absolutely. Well, and we'll come back to game designers in a couple of weeks.
Let's put a pin there.
Uwe Rosenberg will come back. Colosseum, Roman. It's quite complex. I've seen this one played, but I don't have a copy of it myself. Same goes for Stonehenge. I don't have a copy, but I'm just pointing these out as kind of interesting historical challenges. I want to move on to Timeline. This is Timeline Challenge, but you actually put me onto Timeline a few years ago, and I've bought many of the Timeline games. And these are lovely games.
Timeline is an excellent game to look at for your own work, because you're all students. You're having a minimum amount of resources and assets to work with. Timeline is a game pared down to the bone.
Yeah, the image doesn't do it justice. You can the Timeline boxes are just those small little cards here.
Yeah, you can absolutely make your own version of Timeline and it will work just fine. But the thing that Timeline is all about is putting information in a meaningful context. So absolutely have a go at have a look into this one.
Again, moving on and connected to history and connected to military war themes, we get into the theme and the setting of civilization. And I should put kind of brackets around this, because in most instances when we talk about civilization games, we are implying colonization.
Yeah.
And colonization in some ways can be problematic. In other ways, it's very much part of human history and just what humans do. I'm a big fan of Mars, Terraforming Mars, which is a space colonization game, which is nice because it doesn't involve repressing anyone necessarily, or destroying indigenous cultures. When it comes to Mars, I mean, although there are television shows where this we'll show this, but
we'll get onto Exo Squad another time.
Yeah. So
the thing is, when it comes to the conversation about colonialism, even if we wanted to say, look, no, colonialism is just always bad and we're not going to talk about it, to do so in the context of board games would be to take a enormous slab of 40 years of the hobby and just pretend it didn't exist because the theme sucks. And I'm very firmly in the colonialism is bad camp. And yet at the same time, I'm still not going to say, no, we shouldn't talk about these colonialism-based board games, because they are so important and so pervasive. And you just kind of got to look at what we've got here and say, well, time to dismantle this and understand how it works.
Yes, I think what you're doing there is pointing out the difference between colonialism and colonization.
Good point. Yeah, I lumped them together.
Yeah, colonialism is really the disenfranchisement of an indigenous population, usually through extinction level killing and genocide, and a replacing of native and indigenous ways of life with imposed structures from outside, and the kind of importing of class and all sorts of other problems.
Basically, colonialism is colonizing as an ethos.
Yeah.
Whereas
Colon
colonizing spaces,
Yeah.
that's a thing that humans just do. We spread to fill the area around us like a gas.
Boyle's second law. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Buccaneer was one of my favorite games when I was a child, and this is a game where colonialism is the backdrop,
Yes.
whereas this game is really just about stealing each other's treasure.
Yeah, the core of this is a great example of why you can't just say, well, games with colonialism are out, because this game absolutely has colonialism as the reason there are lots of pirates. That's a thing that happened in that period of history in that part of the world. That's why we have the idea of an age of pirates.
It's also... we'll come back and again talk about the materiality of games. And although the image looks quite simple, the pirate boats were lovely, and you had these little plastic pirate boats, and they had little plastic pirate boat sails and little skull and crossbones, and you had little rubies that you could steal from each other, and it was a lot of fun. Civilization. We'll come back and talk about licensed games, but this is an interesting one where a video game is adapted to a board game setting.
Yeah.
And
then there and back again, the story of Civilization.
Yeah, of course, because the most recent versions are heavily influenced by board games.
Yeah.
Stonehenge is, again, that process that you were describing there of colonization, moving into empty spaces and territorializing them. And has that lovely historical element. Puerto Rico, have you played this game?
Yeah, I have. Puerto Rico is the subject of many stories. Puerto Rico is a really, really excellent game. Puerto Rico is, however, very high on the yikes scale.
I think we'll definitely put a pin in Puerto Rico and come back and talk about that in the discussion. Bureaucracy. I think there's some subtle politics going on in that game about the European Union. I've seen it played. I've not played it myself. We'll move on, though.
I always feel a little nervous about anyone making like historical games about history that's still happening.
Tigris and Euphrates is a really great game.
If you remember me mentioning the name Reina Knizia, this is a Reiner Knizia job. And
Reiner is a prolific developer, and this was one of his early ones.
Yeah. I feel kind of bad that I keep coming back to this one as an example of a great Reiner game, because it makes it sound like he hasn't done anything good since. But it's really good.
It's his magnum opus. I think.
And the thing with this one is this. Continue with that vein of Civilization, this one actually has a mechanic in it for something that tends to get ignored in this, which is the collapse of civilizations.
Well said,
the point
yeah.
of Tigris and Euphrates is this isn't just like I build my kingdom and my kingdom is good. It's like, no, periodically your kingdoms all die back, because that's just how things go at this period of history.
I don't have it here. It might be later in the fantasy theme, but one of the games that does that exceptionally well is called Small World. And
yes.
Small World is a fantasy colonization game, a military conflict game, where you deploy a race of gnomes to start with, right? But then over time, your race dies off, and you have to send them into retirement.
Yeah.
Anyway,
there's a polite word for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you get a new race. Yeah. It's a great game. One of my favorites, actually. All right, moving on to science fiction and
double feature. Dr. Moore will build a creature.
I'm not. I missed that.
It's a Rocky Horror Picture Show.
All right. Yes. Nice. Sorry, it's been a while. So, I mean, science fiction and fantasy are probably my two favorite genres and settings. Science fiction, possibly a little bit more so. One of my favorite worlds is Android. And the Android universe is a world that was written, and then Fantasy Flight Games bought the rights to. And Fantasy Flight Games produced a series of very different types of board game, tabletop game experiences set in this universe. And it's a very Blade Runner universe. There are large corporations, there are artificial life forms living in the internet, and cyborgs.
If you as a student look at the kind of subject material we're talking about here and you think, I don't want to spend my time grappling with 20 different things on Board Game Geek, I don't want to have to try and research a giant spread of stuff, and you know that you want to look at science fiction, just look at Android, because Android will give you dozens of different games and game rules and game rule sets and genres of rule sets, whilst all still having a single coherent thematic space.
And this is very clever in terms of marketing, because you can sell the one universe and the same sets of assets over and over and over again. I've got a game of Android that one of them, it takes 20 minutes. This is Android, this on screen, and this game takes about a weekend, and it's basically Cluedo, and it's a detective noir where you have to find out who is murdering synthetic humans, and it's basically a puzzle game, and you literally get puzzle pieces to put a puzzle together as you solve the mystery. It's really great. I'll move on. Roll for the Galaxy. I love this game. I super enjoyed this game. It's space colonization, but you just roll a whole bunch of dice, and you put down cards to build your kind of space empire. Super fun, super effective.
It's no small. It's kind of obvious that a lot of the colonization-based, exploration-based kind of games tend to be Euro games, because that tends to be the country that was caring a lot about that idea space. Roll for the Galaxy is an example of a less Euro version of this, so it's a lot faster and there's a lot more variance. So if you want to check out a game and give it a try, Roll for the Galaxy will not have that same lockup of everyone quietly asking themselves the question of, oh no, what do I do now, that you get in dense Euro games.
Yeah, and the Euro game is more predictable, or rather, you're looking for the perfect strategy, and you can figure out what comes next. Because you're in Roll for the Galaxy, it's a much more hybrid Euro Ameritrash. You're rolling a whole bunch of dice, and so there's just so much randomness being thrown at you, and you're trying to pick your best way, literally picking the best dice through this randomness. Battlestar Galactica is a really nice semi-cooperative game in that...
in case you were wondering if we were going to get really dorky today, Battlestar Galactica.
Fantastic television series. I can't believe it's so old now. They're even talking about rebooting it, and for the 5th time. And in this game, you're on a spaceship, and you're the crew of the spaceship, and someone on the spaceship is an enemy Cylon.
Maybe not.
Maybe not, yeah, you're right. And you have to figure it out before you get blown up. And it's quite good. Galaxy Trucker. You know I love Galaxy Trucker.
Yeah. This is my jam. This is the stuff that got me into board games.
Galaxy Trucker's theme is you are a space hauler, right? You're a space trucker. You're on the route around the galaxy, picking up cargo, fending off space pirates, working with aliens.
You built yourself out of scraps.
It's fantastic, and you build your ship, and then you play against a randomized deck of challenges. Super fun.
Yeah.
Dune.
Oh yes, the venerable old man of the board game space,
certainly
which got a relaunch last year. So if you want to look up videos of Dune, you will find lots of people just this year and last playing this incredibly weird, incredibly interesting game.
Dune, of course, is based on the book by Frank Herbert, and it's on the world Arrakis. So it's a science fiction setting, lots of political intrigue, and it's highly competitive. Actually, you're trying to beat the other players. Terraforming Mars It's probably my favorite game at the moment. Um, I should have put more images in because it's got a lovely board with hexes, and it's very Euro style. You're just building your little Martian cities and space on the board while everyone else is doing theirs, and you're trying to terraform it. You're trying to lift the oxygen content and the heat and create an atmosphere for the future of Mars, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that one's also really worth noting on a thematic level because it's an example of ways that a communal problem, the idea of transforming a planet, is still nonetheless break upable into competitive collaborative parts.
And what I like about it is that Jacob for Alexis basically took Kim Stanley Robinson's science fiction classics, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, and went, okay, how do we make a game out of this? And you as game designers, you can absolutely do the same. You can just go to your bookshelf, find your favorite book that you like. I don't, whether it's Harry Potter, or some interesting,
we've had students make games out of Pretty Little Liars and Kanye West's Twitter feed.
Exactly, and you can just make a game out of it. And through playtesting and iteration, you can get to a great experience. Starting again. All right, so that brings us to children's games. I was actually following I follow a colleague from University of Western Australia, and we're in work from home mode at the moment, and they were Instagramming their experience with Mousetrap, which is a Rube Goldberg machine that is gamified. Very popular, Milton Bradley, high materiality, and its theme is one of the most kind of common household objects and problems, right? That of mice scampering around.
If anything, this game is theme-wise. If anything, this game is a little too cartoony. You've probably already seen this and can't envision the game as much as you can envision what the game does.
I wouldn't say it's a very fun game. I think once you've...
I'm not wild about it. I'm trying not to sit here and...
the fun is kind examples. Of making the thing to work, Yeah. But that's sometimes that's part of the appeal to kids. Sorry. I love this game as a kid. You kind of do nasty things to players and then, say sorry, but it's the game, I get to be...
It's got an amazing lesson about user interface in there. Of like, if this game didn't have the shtick of you apologize when you kick someone back to the start, it would be a much worse game. But by making you be a bit of a dick, it really makes the game hum by comparison.
It works. It really works. Don't Break the Ice. Have you played this?
Yes.
This is fun.
And I've watched a wonderful, wonderful video about a retirement home in, I think it's northern Sydney, where a copy of this was used for a extremely competitive tournament amongst retirees.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Again, the theme is, very thinly stretched. I'm sure you could imagine different themes that would work for this kind of setup, but it's kind of also perfect at the same time.
Yeah. And it tends to make games that use the same theme often wind up making very different games that are great games in their own right, but they're very different beasts.
Guess Who? What is the theme of Guess Who?
So Guess Who originally got its kickoff point as an attempt to get kids to learn about an identikit, which was an old piece of technology police used to use before photography technology and sketch artists were widespread. The basic idea was that you would tell the police who you saw and they would assemble a face out of bits. Guess Who actually got its start as like a kid's version of an identikit. So it's about narking.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Trouble.
Guess Who is also an extremely weird game as far as the fiction goes. For anyone who wants to look into that, there is a comedy video by Cracked about how strange Guess Who is and how strange it has been over time.
It's less people based these days. It's more about cartoon characters and animals and
pizzas. And
yeah, I threw Trouble in there because I wanted to kind of hint towards, and this, so whereas Sorry has the theme of saying sorry, Trouble is getting into a little bit more abstract territory, and
Trouble is extremely abstract and it's deliberate.
We'll talk more about abstraction later on, but abstraction and not having a theme and not having a setting is actually a theme and a setting in itself.
Yeah, and in the case of this one, Trouble is bringing a lot of baggage with it from an extremely weird place.
The Game of Life. This is basically a Milton Bradley game designed to teach you why it's important to buy in life insurance.
Yeah. Stay in school.
Don't do drugs, kids.
Don't do drugs.
Yep. Have a family, right? This is all about the nuclear family, right? Getting married, having kids.
Yeah.
Being a productive member of society.
We've bagged on Snakes and Ladders in general because it's essentially just like a clockwork machine where it just plays itself once. As long as you're continuing to engage with the game, it's going to play itself. The Game of Life is the same thing, but for baby boomers. It's really very specifically one set of ethical values of like, this is mostly what your life is going to be like, so don't heck it up.
And just roll and move and keep trudging on until you die.
Yeah, and children are a natural improvement to your life because they are seen as improving value, not because, they're these amazing, wonderful little people that get to be part of your life or anything like that. No, it's this very, very soulless kind of miserable vision of getting invested in your own family.
Moving on then to another theme setting. Theme is fantasy, and the settings we'll talk about a little bit more closely in a second. The first setting is, of course, Lord of the Rings, and I couldn't.
In a lot of ways, the first setting.
Yeah, exactly. The first fantasy setting. Well, we can about that.
Gilgamesh. We're going to talk about Gilgamesh here in my house in front of my salad.
Mythology. But there are so many great Lord of the Rings games. This is the cooperative version where you have to throw the ring into Mount Doom before Sauron gets you, which is super nice. And I lent my copy to someone and it never came back. And I don't blame them because it's a great game. I would have stolen it too. Game of Thrones.
We were going to license the music to do that big jokey opening theme music, but
we'll get banned.
Copyright strike.
Get banned off YouTube. Runebound. Pretty generic kind of fantasy setting, but actually quite a fun game.
Yeah, Runebound is an example of what we get into when we start talking about generic themes, because Runebound, there is very little set in Runebound apart from any other specific fantasy setting, but the game's systems and rules are pretty tight.
Yeah.
And that's an example of, like, imagine, if you will, a dial turning between caring about fiction and caring about mechanics. And in case of Runebound, it's turned a little bit more towards the mechanics side.
And you'll be noticing as you're listening to this, Richard and I can't avoid talking about mechanics.
Yeah.
And this is when we come back in next lecture, we're going to definitely focus on mechanics and specific generic mechanics. And then we'll come back to combining these two more specifically and thinking about how they're working together. This is just a kind of overview.
We're bringing up mechanics here, particularly because you're going to have to look at these things. We're not just saying, here is everything you need to know about this game. The reason I keep bringing up mechanics is so that you as a student can go, well, he mentioned this thing. He mentioned it's approachable in these ways. I'll check that out because I want to learn about the fiction.
Shadows over Camelot is a lovely Days of Wonder game, and this version has painted miniatures, which I highly approve of.
This is an amazing game.
Is this a cooperative game?
Kinda.
It's been a while since I've played it.
The bit that drives Shadows over Camelot is that it's a game with a trader mechanic.
Yeah, right.
It's not necessarily a game with a trader mechanic. Not every game is going to have a trader in it, and that tension is part of what drives the game. It's right. It's really excellent design.
It's like Battlestar Galactica in a way.
Yes.
And of course, the setting is kind of prehistory England and the notion of,
stuff.
Yeah, the notion of the court of Camelot. And again, it doesn't have to be historically accurate, which is great. Talisman is a kind of D&D game played as though it was Monopoly.
It's the Monopoly of the fantasy games set. And that's not to sound like a slam, because we've made fun of Monopoly quite a lot. But Talisman is a lovely boy. It is trying hard. It's just
Talisman got me into playing D&D. Yeah. So it's what we call a gateway drug. It's
a foundational game.
It's a foundational game, absolutely. Heroquest again. So I went from Talisman to Heroquest before D&D, and you can see here it's got some of the D&D trappings of dungeon diving, miniatures, figures, and so it's a real hybrid tabletop miniature game experience.
Yeah. Note as well that Heroquest is hybrid collaborative, in that you are typically playing against one player, but that player does want you to get through the game eventually. So it's a really interesting. You're going to find like competing visions of like what the job of the person running the game is.
I'll move through because I don't want to spend too much. Oh, there's Small World. And that's Small World Underground. That's the version that I have, and you can see it's this kind of generic fantasy world. Like you can if you're creating a fantasy world for your game, you can go on a super deep dive, creating all the lore, all the races and the geography and the history of that world. You can go massively deep. What would be a good example of a fantasy game that does that?
I would argue Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Incredibly deep lore. If you want to, you can spend hours on the internet just learning about Magic lore and Magic characters.
So the opposite of that is Small World Underground, where you just have this kind of blobbish map that's just generic lava and crystal forests and mushroom people. And then the races are just, mudmen and merfolk. And sprites.
Mudmen and merfolk sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. This game works really well, but because it is fantasy light, my kids love it because they can project all the fantasy tropes they want to onto these races and this world, and there's nothing in the lore that tells them that they're wrong.
Yeah, it's not getting in their way, and that's the thing you're also going to find. Like, some of you want to write like really deep lore and like great fiction for your narrative, and that's absolutely beautiful and great. I encourage it. But also some of you kind of don't care, and that's also totally valid.
Moving on to horror, and I've particularly singled out the Lovecraft mythos. So this is probably my third favorite setting. So big fan of Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a writer working about 100 years ago now. And so most of his short stories, and which are all connected within this one universe, are in the public domain. And so there are issues. You can't take specific names because they are trademarked, but you can you can't create a game and call it Arkham Horror, because that is trademarked by Fantasy Flight Games. But you can create a game that is set in the Lovecraftian city of Arkham.
Yeah.
And so Lovecraft is kind of the progenitor for the horror genre and the supernatural genre and the kind of creepy otherworldly setting.
Horror.
The cosmic horror. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more of a history of horror going before him, like Mary Shelley and stuff. So just in case anyone hearing this lecture later, he just missed the word cosmic.
Thank you. I wouldn't put Shelley as horror. She's what you call gothic.
Yeah, but she definitely kicked off horror.
And then gothic becomes horror. See, so I mean, if we're talking literary genre theory, we're going to do romanticism and the romantics. We're then going to do
your
gothic
backyard.
horror.
I'm not coming to your backyard to fight you.
I might skip over some of these because I just want to point out that the public domain is a brilliant source of materials and settings and worlds. I noticed that Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian setting is due to come into the public domain next year. I think it is.
I think so.
Tarzan is almost in the public domain.
Tarzan's in a nebulous spot. The earliest novels are public domain, but not all of it.
Yeah. So, Fantasy Flight Games have an entire, again, like Android, they have a whole range of experiences within this one setting. And of course, zombies, right, is related to this.
Yeah.
And there's a series. Well, not a series. There's an enormous range of zombie experiences. I'm going to skip over onto licensed board games.
From the public domain to the absolute exact opposite.
Great point. Yeah, shifting from the public domain and stuff that you can use to your heart's content to stuff that you can't touch at all, probably forever. And that's all Disney, Marvel, Star Wars. I mean, it's all Disney. Geez, anything. 95% of popular culture you will not be able to make a board game for, unless you pitch a game. And so sometimes companies will go to a board game designer and say, "Hey, we want you to make a board game for us." Doom, the board game, is a classic example of this. And it's just put lots of popular mechanics together. You can see Heroquest in there. You can see elements of Talisman, and that you're building up characters. You've got dice rolling, and it's just a generic kind of tabletop shoot 'em up game. We talked about Risk. Well, isn't Risk great? You can slap any kind of conquest theme on top of Risk, and suddenly you've got Risk, Lord of the Rings. There you go. Dark Souls. Okay, have to point out that a lot of people really like this game, and this game was kickstarted.
Yeah,
and so it has very large miniatures and lots of people contributing to its development.
Yeah, we're going to go in on Kickstarter and its impact on types of games, especially when we talk about materiality. I don't want to dunk on this game too hard, but this is a game that exists.
I've not played it, but we did have a student a couple of years ago who is a massive Dark Souls fan, and she loved this game. Mm-hmm. So who am I to say otherwise?
I mean, I'm a pretty big Dark Souls fan.
Are you? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I didn't spend $300 on the on the Kickstarter though, so I guess how massive a fan can I really be?
You didn't sell a kidney for that?
No,
I'm unimpressed. Again, we're talking about slapping game systems with different settings. Catan, a Game of Thrones. It's just Catan, but the pieces have Game of Thrones characters. Yeah. Yay for that. And Dune. We're back at Dune again.
The economy game.
Yeah.
Which crosses over in the colonialism game a lot of the time.
Absolutely. There's a game that it's here. I'm going to skip over Imperial and talk about Indonesia. This is the kind of Dutch people, you could say invasion, right, of Indonesia, and really interesting economic game.
Again, look look at the visuals of how that game looks. It looks like a wall calendar for accountants who are
Yes.
afraid of being too exciting.
And you basically need an Excel spreadsheet to do well at this game.
Yeah.
Monopoly doesn't work. Power Grid. We've talked a lot about Power Grid.
Yes.
As a Euro.
Friedman.
Again, that's a game where you can have a spreadsheet approach to.
Yeah. By the way, these games all evolve in different directions. Power Grid is honestly pretty cool as far as an economic game goes, because it's not about it's less about exploiting people and more about building efficient infrastructure. And like, could there be a more German thing in this context?
I've had plenty of great games with Power Grid, and
yeah,
you take it slow. A rainy afternoon is really lovely, and you just try and build the most efficient system you can. And you'll get 6 turns deep, and you're like, oh, if only I'd done this one thing differently. And you make a note of that, and you try and do that the next time you play.
Well, that's the joke, isn't it? It's like, well, why did I lose? Well, you did not play efficiently in the first turn, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
That's how this goes.
Oh, my. I am. Okay. Acquire. I just threw that in there because I like the board. I've never played the game, but it's interesting. Buy low, sell high. Can you get any more?
Can you cook it down to its absolute minimum?
This game looks terrible. I have no idea how it plays.
Similarly, if you want a little more of a gentle version of this, check out Oink Games Startups.
All right, I'm making a note of that. We can take a look.
Yeah, we definitely want to jam it. If I can get an excuse to get the uni to pay to import me a copy of Startups from Japan.
Science. This is a theme that I am really fond of, particularly with young kids. Pandemic is very timely. In fact, I saw an article in the conversation the other day: is what can pandemic tell us about Hong Kong's response to COVID-19?
Cooperate, you ding dongs. Wash your hands.
Yeah. Photosynthesis is just a beautiful board game, a lovely experience. We'll come back to the concept of philosophy engines, what games teach us, and photosynthesis is very much about getting you to think about spatial relations in a forest-like situations and what it's like to be a tree.
Chris, I'm not trying to blow you up here, but I think Eve Conquests might have gotten lost on the way from the science fiction section.
Yeah, probably. Let's skip that. Evolution is a great game for teaching kids about the processes of evolution. The science in it, we can actually debate whether how accurate or how authentic or whatever, but that's not really board game's job. If a board game is teaching you the exact processes of how DNA works, it's probably going to get really boring unless you're a really great game designer.
Yeah. I don't think you can do it, but if you can do it, do it. Please.
Maybe Richard Garfield could do something with the way DNA works, but evolution is a great way to teach basic concepts, and it's fun, it's bright, it's interesting, it's fast.
It's got a big dinosaur meeple. I mean, come on.
It works so well.
I'm such a child.
This is Bios Genesis is about the forming of the primordial soup from which life evolves. I've not played this game. I've always wanted to play this game to see if it was any good, see if you can take a really specific scientific concept and make it an enjoyable, playable experience. I'm not sure.
You could also look into a cousin of this game by Ryan Metzler, which is CO2.
Oh, yes. All right. We'll come back to that one. Moving on then. Compounded. I've seen this in various iterations, and it's quite funny because there's a Minecraft world that does something very similar. All right. Let's try and get through these last ones a bit faster. Murder and Mystery. You've got the
fiction-wise, this one sets you up for a whole bunch of easy mechanics because it's a piece of hidden information. So all these games are about deducing a piece of hidden information.
Pluto. The theme is the murder mystery. The setting can be different. My daughter's got a Harry Potter Cluedo that's quite good. Sherlock Holmes consulting detective, right? This is again the public domain. Someone has taken the cases of Sherlock Holmes and turned them into the most nerdiest game you could ever imagine. In fact, you're given a case book and you have to read newspaper articles to find the clues.
It's a choose your own adventure book you play with your friends.
It's so nerdy and
it's so fantastically nerdy.
Just wonderful. I've played a couple of these.
So hard as nails.
Oh, it's super hard. I don't think I've ever done one effectively. Orient Express again. This is taking
public domain.
No.
Agatha Christie is not public domain.
No, she's not that old.
Take me as legal advice.
But just a really nice setting. A murder on a train. Very, very effective. Scotland Yard. Oh my gosh, do I love Scotland Yard? I am terrible at Scotland Yard. I've always been bad at it, but I always love playing this game. 5 people are detectives. You're tracking down the X character on a map of a thematic, very stylistic version of London. Sorry. Have you played Scotland Yard?
Yes. Scotland Yard is amazing for those of you who are currently looking for games that you can play in a limited state. Scotland Yard is a phone app now as well, and the phone version of the game is pretty tight, and it does random matchmaking with strangers. So you can absolutely go try out Scotland Yard right now on your phone, and it will be this will give you a perfectly good vision of how the board game works.
Great tip, thank you. I'm downloading.
Scotland Yard is it's a classic of the genre of hidden movement mystery games. And so it's kind of, typically speaking, when we talk about classics, like Monopoly comes up, and this is sort of like, it's perfectly good, and it got people into the genre. But no, like Scotland Yard is still great.
It's an odd one because it's a mass market game.
Yeah, and I'm not used to the games that you could buy in a supermarket being so great, but Scotland Yard is really fantastic.
All right, I'm buying it as we speak. Okay, Mysterium. Mysterium fits into that genre of games where there's an element of storytelling, which is quite fun. But it's still a whodunit.
Cards on the table. I love this game so much. It's hard for me to be completely objective about it. It is an amazing example of a communication game. The piece of hidden information is not very difficult. It's not a very complicated piece of information. It's just the method the game limits you to communicate with is awful. Definitely one to check out. Definitely one to watch people playing the game of, because watching this game being played gives you so much of the rules of how it's being played. And streamers love to stream this one because it's so fun to watch people struggle with.
I don't pretend to hide any of my bias. This is a great game. There's also an app for this, so you can go and play Mysterium. That's a little bit more expensive. Scotland Yard is only 99 cents on the App Store.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to move on to sport. Again, I don't think jumping through the slides too quickly. I'm not going to talk too much about this. Sport is a very viable genre of tabletop experiences. I had the original test match when I was younger. And I would play the game while watching the test match cricket. Because when you're a kid, test matches are kind of boring.
To be fair, I'm an adult. Still not that into test matches.
Formula One, roll and move. Super simple.
Really, really, we bag on roll and move a lot. Check out Formula D and Downshift. They are trying to do something with roll and move that's interesting.
Camel Cup is simultaneously camel racing and betting, but it's two kind of setting themes. Street soccer, super fun little role soccer simulator. Very, very simple. Flamme Rouge.
Yes.
I threw this in because one of my colleagues is a massive Tour de France fan, and I showed her this, and she laughed until I left the room.
Flamme Rouge is a really, really good game.
It is a good game.
Again, you can find long Let's Plays of it on YouTube if you want to check those out.
But what I was trying to point out there is that sports fans aren't necessarily the people who are the audience for these games.
Yeah, it's true.
Battle Ball is I mean, we see this trope in science fiction a lot, where you have kind of armored figures on roller skates, basically just beating each other up. What was the most recent version? Alita Battle Angel.
Yeah. I mean, sorry. Anime Club Talon just left out. Okay. Here we go.
Party games. So we're now into the kind of theme where the theme isn't necessarily what's in the game. It's the theme of, that we're having a group of people that don't necessarily know how to interact with each other. How do we make it a more interesting experience? And so this is where the theme of party games come from. You've got Boulder Dash.
Relatedly to that, because you have one of the things that's unspokenly happening here is the theme is something people buy into. You have to be okay with a theme. You have to choose to engage with a theme. These party games don't know if people are going to engage with a theme, so they don't ask you to. So there is an interesting mechanic there where the fiction this is creating is very much different in form to the other kinds of fiction we've been talking about.
Well said. So I guess I've got Twister on screen.
Yeah, Twister's a really weird game.
It's so weird.
In one of the most puritanical periods of our history, someone successfully marketed a board game about rubbing your body against other people's.
All right.
And, more power to them.
That is where I think we can finish today, and we can end our discussion of themes and settings there. I think that's given us a huge amount to tackle and talk about in the Discord hangout this week.
Yep. And I mean, hopefully this has helped you appreciate that, while board games do have a breadth of themes, lots of different themes live across lots of different types of board games. It's not as simple as a theme ties you to a set of mechanics.
Well said. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much for including me, and I hope all the students had a wonderful time.
I'll see you in the next one.
Yep. Which for us is probably going to be a couple of days' time. Okay.
Bye.